we are, focused on broadly on gender-based violence. There will be two of us presenting. I will just do a very brief introduction, and then you will get some, then we'll be followed by Elizabeth Corey, who will be presenting some very powerful information and deep insights that she has gleaned in her work over the years. So it's an honor to have an expert like Elizabeth to present to all of us and talk about the culture of family-controlled trafficking. So welcome, everybody. Here's a brief rundown about the technology.
Thank you for joining us for our webinar, The Culture of Family-Controlled Trafficking. We have a few brief technological background slides for you first. For audio options, if you haven't already, you can dial in to 712-770-4005 and use the passcode 524825 followed by the pound sign. If you have any technical issues, please call iLink Tech Support at 1-800-799-4510. Feel free to ask any questions in the public chat box, and I can relay this technical assistance phone number with you there as well. When using the chat box, it's good practice to announce yourself beginning with your name, your organization name, as well as the city and state where you are based.
Crystal
For example, I would type my name and Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, Oakland, California. For the PowerPoint portion of the presentation, the slides will be shared via email. We sent out an email yesterday afternoon to everyone who had registered in advance. Additionally, participants will also receive a link to any materials that are mentioned in the presentation and a link to the recording of the webinar following the session. It will take a few hours after the webinar's conclusion in order to send that out, so please check later tonight or tomorrow. I'll also send a follow-up email just to let everyone know that it's available. Once you exit, you will see a brief survey about this webinar. Please take a moment to respond. We do take your feedback and suggestions into account as we think about our future webinars and how to present them. I also wanted to mention that if you are dialed into our audio option, please mute your speakerphone or mute your call. We are hearing a little bit of background noise from some individuals who are on but haven't muted their phones. So with that technological background, I will pass the floor to our first presenter, Chick Dabby.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Please mute your phones so we can hear only the presenters. Thank you. All right, so trafficking has received a lot of prominence in the federal plan, and this webinar focuses on the core value that you see in the middle of the slide there, that survivors play a key role in elevating our understanding and awareness of human trafficking, improving service delivery, and informing policies. The definition of trafficking, most of you and many of you will be familiar with it. It's only here for your reference, but the critical pieces about trafficking are understanding the actions, means, and purposes that define what trafficking is. And there are many reasons, many purposes people are trafficked for, as you can see on the slide there. In terms of continuing with the definitions, with domestic minor sex trafficking refers to the commercial sexual abuse and exploitation of minors. And DMST has received a lot of attention in the last few years with the President's Commission paying attention to trafficking on a larger scale. And that's why this webinar also focuses on domestic minor sex trafficking and one of the forms of it. Similarly, there's the definition of commercial sexual exploitation of children, which takes a lot of different crimes and rolls them up into this definition. Now, just a brief analytic point about the root causes of sex trafficking. Culturally, of course, we all, many of us live in the landscape where the culture of gender-based violence, sexism, and devaluation normalizes the objectification of female bodies, where abusing women and girls and LGBTQ individuals is also normalized. And in addition, victim blaming is part of that larger culture of gender-based oppression. Amongst the other root causes, of course, trafficking exploits vulnerability and poverty, and it relies on the male demands for commodified sex. And the nexus of predation and impunity is an important one to consider when we talk about root causes. Where mostly predatory behavior is seen as a normal aspect of masculinity. And finally, of course, trafficking is an incredibly lucrative financial organization and business. I would ask everyone to please mute their phones. So who is trafficked? Minors, adults, Native women, girls, refugees, immigrants, foreign-born and U.S. individuals, and LGBTQ youth. Who are the traffickers? There's a range of traffickers, as many of you would know from the work that you're doing. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to turn the presentation over to Elizabeth Corey, who will talk about when the traffickers are family members and friends of the family. Elizabeth is a writer, speaker, trainer, and sex abuse and trafficking survivor who reaches into her own trauma journey to educate, support, and deepen our understanding of holistic harms and healing. So, Elizabeth, thank you very much for the honor of presenting on this webinar, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Chick. I really appreciate that. Thank you to everybody who has joined today. I know you are hearing a little bit of interference, including some dings. I'm being told that the dings cannot be stopped. Those are people who are joining the call. So I think what we can all learn from this is don't join the calls late. Just kidding. So let's talk a little bit about the culture of family-controlled trafficking, which is what I am here to bring to you today. There is not a lot that's being said on this topic, which is why I feel it is so important that I do this work. So 1 second here. Getting over my minor technical difficulties. So what are you going to learn today? What I'd like to bring to you is how does a family culture of trafficking, abuse, and domestic violence render young victims hopeless and voiceless? So what is it that is creating this epidemic of people who have just given up on ever being able to live a normal life, which is what I see every day in my work? What factors cover up the truth behind the family cult? So we're going to talk about all of the different ways that people in these types of families keep their secrets. And then what are the symptoms of chronic trauma that is perpetrated by those who we are supposed to trust the most? I think that the chronic and complex trauma is unfortunately quite common in
muted. Unmuted.
Okay. I think I got muted there for a second. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the next one is, what are the symptoms of chronic trauma perpetuated by those who we are supposed to trust most? What I see in my own work here is that while complex trauma is unfortunately relatively common, I believe that it is particularly difficult for those where that trauma is perpetrated by people in our own families. And then what are trauma-informed approaches to easing the burden of these young people through relationships with trust and understanding? So that is a high level of what we're going to talk about. So some of the stereotypes of families that traffic. I definitely want to cover these because unfortunately we see a lot of this in the media, and it impacts our opinions of what trafficking looks like. And because of that, it can sometimes make us unaware of who might be being trafficked right under our noses, especially in the work that we do. So the first stereotype, it doesn't happen in the United States. That is absolutely false. It happens all the time in the United States. Another stereotype, they are criminals and are constantly in trouble with the law. And as I talk a little bit more today, you will see how that is actually not true. They are poor and they need to make money in unethical ways. What I think we have learned about people who make money is that often when they make some money, they want to make more money, and when they make more money, they want to make even more money. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they are in dire need of paying their most basic bills. They are of certain ethnic backgrounds, also very untrue. Unfortunately, we have a habit in this country of highlighting stories about people who are from different ethnic backgrounds and who have been trafficked. But we don't always highlight people who have been trafficked who maybe are coming from Caucasian backgrounds or other backgrounds that we consider to be people that would not likely be trafficked. They lack power in society, also not true. As a matter of fact, a lot of people who traffic are looking specifically for power, and they will often find power in other ways as well. The next one, the family dysfunction is obvious. And I'm going to talk a lot about this as we go through the slides, but this idea that families who traffic are incredibly good at masking their dysfunction. So we have to have an understanding that there is, this is an art. These people who do this are artists in a way that they can cover up what is actually happening within the family. And the final stereotype here is trafficked children are failing in school and obviously need psychological intervention. That is not true. It can be true. Don't get me wrong. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every single child who's being trafficked is doing well in school or is masking their mental health needs. But many children have learned the same skills that their parents are using to hide the trafficking and the trauma that they are enduring. As a matter of fact, I've heard from many people who grew up in these types of families who say school was the only safe haven they had. So I'm going to talk to you for a second about my story, just so you can get an idea of why it is that I'm sitting on this call with you today talking about this subject as an expert. I do have a background of family-controlled trafficking in my own childhood. And in my case, it was generational. And what I mean by that is my parents didn't wake up one day and say, I think I'll traffic. This had been happening for at least 2 generations prior to my parents, and I'm sure it probably went back much further than that. We grew up in a suburban neighborhood. We were middle class. We had the white picket fence, you know, all of the things that you assume are a traditional, healthy American family. My physical abuse started in infancy. I was actually colicky, and there were times when I was suffocated in order to get me to stop crying. So that was the first memories that I personally have, mainly body memories of physical abuse. The sexual abuse started in my toddler years, and this is really important. When families are going to traffic their children, it really does start very, very young, and there is a process that happens to desensitize children to sex abuse and sex in general. So the sex abuse started very young and by multiple people in the family, not just by one person. So next, the trafficking itself for me, happened between the ages of 7 and 9. Okay? So most of the statistics we hear say that trafficking victims, especially DMST victims, start around somewhere between the ages of 11 and 14. I have found in my discussions with many other family controlled trafficking victims that they actually were trafficked much younger as well. So I think that if there was a study done on this, we might find that family controlled trafficking actually starts earlier.
Aditi Agarwal, San Jose.
Pimp controlled trafficking. And if you are on the phone and you're talking and I can hear you, you mute your phone, please. Thank you. So, I also wanted to mention that I did have a brief interaction with child welfare when I was growing up, and unfortunately they were unable to establish enough proof and would get past my parents, who were relatively powerful in the community, in order to get me safe. By the age of 9, I was essentially broken. And what I mean when I say I was broken is I had stopped asking for help. I had stopped looking to be saved from my trafficking situation. So that is a really important point, because it's critical that families get their children to the point that they break them. If not, the children will eventually find to help. Oh, excuse me. So we're going to start off by talking about the trafficker. The familial trafficker will become well known in the community. What I mean by that is power and control are fundamental to the trafficker. I often talk about sex trafficking and sex abuse as not really actually being anything having to do with sex. It's really all about power. And what we find in family-controlled trafficking situations is that the power is not something that just happens within the family or within the relationship between parent and child. It can also happen in many other ways. For example, they may actually join associations and organizations to gain power. For example, a homeowners association or something of that nature. They may join boards of trustees to make powerful contacts. They will value powerful friendships. For example, my trafficker, he valued his relationship with judges, with police officers, with government officials. If he could meet somebody who was, let's say, a state senator, he was extremely excited about having that relationship. So power and control were fundamental to him. They may have a powerful job if they're able to get one. If they're able to climb the ladder, they will always try to do that and gain power. They are very obsessed with power and control. It's a really important point. The problem with this is that a trafficker who is obsessed with power isn't going to always look that different from anybody else we consider to be a valued member of society. Because honestly, power and control are considered to be a relatively valuable asset in our society. So one thing to consider is that may not make them an obvious target for somebody who needs to be questioned. So they will live a double life. They will have connections to unlawful authority figures too. And once again, it will most likely be powerful, unlawful authority figures. So they may have connections to gangs and pimps. In many cases, including with my trafficker, he was connected with gangs and pimps because he was a customer of those who were also trafficking other children. So it wasn't just that he was interested in trafficking me or trading me. He was very interested in also being a customer. So he made these connections with gangs and pimps. The familial trafficker will use money and other tactics to control these unlawful authoritative figures. It's pretty likely that at some point during that relationship, he will threaten to turn them in if they don't do things for him. So this kind of needing of power exists on all sorts of different levels. The familial trafficker may, like I was saying, be the customer, or may ask them to do dirty work for money. And what I found in my own childhood is this dirty work would usually include the intimidation of witnesses and victims. So This is important to know that, it's very, very difficult to be a family controlled trafficker and not draw attention to yourself at all. They do a very, very good job of avoiding attention and keeping their mask on, but there are times when witnesses do need to be intimidated, and when you have this connection to these unlawful figures, you have people that can help you do that. So the familial trafficking keeps the family in upheaval at all times. This is a very critical point. There is no time when people in the family who are victims or who are being trafficked or who are enabling the trafficking can rest. Okay? The idea is to keep these people in fight, flight, or freeze mode at all times. Constant trauma means constant control over all memories of the family. Never let them rest. Never let them calm down. Never let them get to a place where they could start to think clearly about what is happening. So some of the ways that they do that, the trafficker will invoke competition between siblings, very similarly to the way that a pimp would of his victims or her victims. So competition is critical, because if all the victims are competing against each other, then they're not going to kind of collude or gang up against the trafficker or figure out a way out or realize what they're in the middle of and work together to escape it. So my sister and I were pitted up against each other from the very beginning, and to this day we absolutely hate each other. So I think that's a really important aspect of what the trafficker is doing, whether or not they're a family trafficker or a pimp. All forms of violence are used to control. So while sexual abuse is certainly a part of the picture, it is not everything. And that includes physical violence, verbal violence, emotional violence, and neglect. There is something, children, some of the most damage I have seen done in the work that I've done with survivors has been in the abandonment and the neglect that they have experienced. It is tremendously fear-inducing. So the sexual abuse and physical abuse start as soon as children are born, as I mentioned before. That is very important because it just normalizes the rape and violence, and that is a big, big part of the brainwashing. And then there are threats. There are threats that are used, threats of death, of injury, of financial destitution. Those are especially important for the trafficker to employ when children and adults, or when children get older, and for the adults who are also a part of this process. Because even though many times adults who are not trafficking are enabling the process, they're in many cases being abused themselves, being raped themselves, being physically beat up. In many cases, in the stereotypical case where you have the father as the trafficker and the mother as the enabler, the mother is often being raped and beaten as well to continue the process of keeping her in that place of fear. Don't get me wrong, in my case, my mother was by no means innocent, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. Right now, actually. This is the enabler. So when I talk about the enabler, and in my case, yes, it really was the mother, but it doesn't have to be. I want to be very clear that while the stereotype is often that a trafficker is a male, and in a family an enabler is female, that is certainly not always the case. But I am going to talk to you about the enabler from a perspective of what types of things my mother and my grandmother did in order to promote and enable the trafficking. So to start off with, the enabler is responsible for removing the hope of rescue by reinforcing the powerlessness. This is their most important role. At all times, they are to remove hope. The enabler uses emotional and mental abuse, manipulation, and gaslighting to make the child question their memories and their beliefs. And I've listed several of what they would, kind of phrases that they might use. Nobody will ever trust you when you talk that nonsense. I heard things like women and children are here to sleep men. That was one of my grandmother's quotes. Excuse me, my throat is causing me problems. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Okay, another quote that I would hear is, "You cannot survive without this family. We will not love you if you don't comply. You make things up or you are crazy." So speaking of you are crazy, I see that we have a question about gaslighting. So I just wanted to mention really quickly that gaslighting is actually a term that means making the other person feel as if they've gone crazy. So they're making something up, they're seeing things, they're dreaming what they're saying. It's not real. It's some kind of fantasy that the other person is living in. I think the term actually came from a movie, maybe from the 1950s or 60s, where a man was convincing his wife that she was seeing things when in reality she wasn't. So that's where the term comes from. It's becoming very popular among survivor communities who are in recovery. It's kind of a bit of a buzzword, but it is a reality for many of us who grew up believing that what we were experiencing was that we're somehow making it up. So most enablers are aware of the abuse and trafficking on a conscious or unconscious level. This is really an important point because I hear from people all the time who say, your mother must not have known about it. She certainly would have saved you. I think we have to understand, and I used to think that maybe she didn't know until I started getting my memories back that made it clear that she did. But then I also became a mother, and I realized that there was no way. There was no way I could have been trafficked under my mother's nose without her knowing. And I think that many enablers have experienced something just as horrific when they were growing up, and this is a generational situation where the trauma is cycling through the next generation. So in many cases, they may have practiced some pretty severe levels of dissociation. When I say dissociation, I mean they have either forgotten what happened to them, or they have suppressed a good portion of it, or suppressed the emotional aspect of it. And so when they learn that it's happening to their children, most of that information may get pushed into an unconscious level pretty quickly in the process. That being said, on some level they are aware. So enablers may be coordinating or arranging the trafficking as well. They're not innocent. In my case, my mother was also responsible for doing some of the coordination as well of the trafficking, so she was certainly not innocent. I didn't know that at first, but then when I got some more of my memories back, I realized that she was. I see a question: when working with a survivor and their enabler also has a history of abuse, how do you address it with survivor and their family? That is a really interesting question. It can be very difficult because while they are a victim of abuse, they are also perpetrating abuse. So there has to be a way to start breaking that cycle. And in my case, my parents have been unwilling to even examine the fact that there was any pain that they have endured because they have repressed it, they have pushed it down, they have dissociated from it. And so they actually refused to come out of it, even addressing the fact that they were perpetrators at all or that they experienced any of their own abuse. In some environments, if you're working with families and the perpetrators are willing to say, I went through this too. There can be serious family healing that can happen from that, but unfortunately, with the pain involved, it can be very difficult to get admissions of that. I'm not sure if I completely answered the question, but feel free to ask more if you need more on that. But that is difficult. And sometimes I also hear from survivors, what do I do? What do I do? I have this family, and they've done these horrible things to me. They've trafficked me, they've abused me, but they're family. So we have to really have that conversation about whether or not it makes sense for them to remove, these are adult survivors, for them to remove themselves from these families and leave the family behind. And that is often a question, and you would think it would be an easy, oh, yes, I'm going to leave, of course, but it's just not easy because these are their parents. It's a very difficult decision, and it always requires much contemplation. So the next one. The enabler will manipulate the child to gain trust until they reveal plans or secret friendships. I cannot tell you how many times this happened to me. It really took away every ounce of trust that I had in the world. My enabler would very often come to me and pretend that she was my friend and that she loved me and that she was really my mother and that, she hadn't eaten my mother instead. Sorry, that's my attempt at a joke. You guys can pretend to laugh. But in reality, she was just trying to find out information from me that she could use against me later. And it really did a number on my trust. I just heard that somebody lost volume. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
This is Chick. Yes, we can hear you. It might be individual.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I think maybe there was an internet volume issue. Okay. Great. So the next one is the enabler will also encourage sibling competition in a big way. They will compare siblings, but they will do it a little differently, where the trafficker may compare siblings as saying, well, you're being a better victim, where the enabler will actually do things like compare siblings and their talents, or say my favorite sibling today is you, or you're the smart one and you're the pretty one. This is one of the more common ones that I heard when I was growing up. I was the smart one and my sister was the pretty one. So these are the types of things that enablers will do. Sorry, 1 second. I think I've hit this pointer thing again. I think I know how to use a computer. I'm having trouble moving the slide forward with my arrow keys. Not sure what I've done. 1 second, guys.
Elizabeth, this is Chick. Let me try. Oh, I see. Yeah, it's not moving forward. 1 moment.
Oh, I just got it to move. I tried something different. Okay.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, I already had it moved. I'll move it back. I figured something out. Thank you, Chick. The next one, the enabler will treat the abused and trafficked child as the other woman or the other man. This is probably one of the most shameful and hard to digest aspects of dealing with these kind of families. The child is actually, of course, the one that's shamed as the cause of the abuse and the trafficking. That concept is not really that new. We hear that a lot. But the competition between the enabler and the child starts when the child is very young. So all of a sudden it becomes the child who has created this horrible situation, and the child then becomes the other woman, the other man. And as the child gets older, this competition may morph into things, like especially as the child grows to adulthood, it may morph into competitions on financial earnings, material possessions, traveling, for who's doing the best job at pretending to be happy. And that can, that really does continue into adulthood. I can't tell you the number of times before I left the family that I had competitions with my mother about who was traveling to the coolest place and who made the most money. Those are not healthy interactions with a parent. So, but these are very common. So, what does a family look like to the outside world? The key to living in a family is looking as normal as possible. There is an art to wearing the mask of normalcy. I think I was mentioning this a little bit earlier. So children will attend regular schools, and they often do well because they are threatened to do well. They are told that doing well is critical to their survival, so they will do well. But as I mentioned earlier, many children do well because they consider it the only safe place, or the only place where they can figure out what the rules are to do well. Children will still do activities in sports, and of course, just like with school performance, good performance is critical at these activities and sports. The families are often financially viable. Middle and upper class is common. Families are particularly interested in material things and status symbols, and the house will look immaculate. Okay, I mean, you don't walk in the front door of a house where there is trafficking going on and immediately go, there's trafficking here. That just isn't going to happen. These families are way too good at this, and it has been passed down for a long, long time. So I think it's really critical that we understand they don't look like we think they look. The entire family will have power and control in the community. They will have connections with other important families. And that effort will largely be led by the trafficker, but he's not necessarily the only one who's playing that game. Everybody's involved. And there is a language for discovering others with the same criminal minds. They really do find each other. And my family was a part of a community of families who were all trafficking, sexually abusing their children, and they would trade children. In my situation, they actually traded children, and as a front, they called it a babysitting co-op. So they would send children to other families to be, abused, and they were basically trafficking because they would trade children back and forth. There would be money that would pass hands, but there would also be other favors that would pass, that they would trade. They would trade things, material possessions. So it wasn't always just as simple as handing over a child and getting money back for that. The entire family will work to discredit anyone who questions the illegal activities. While the trafficker does have a tremendous amount of power, and they've worked very, very hard to, have that power, other people in the family will also help to make sure that anyone who stands up against the family is discredited. In my family, there were people who wanted to help me who lost their jobs because of my father and other members of my family who were outed as gay. And keep in mind, this was back in the late 70s, early 80s. That was a big problem back then, if you were outed. So there were some real threatening activities that were going on. So another really important point, and this is where families can act a lot like pimps as well. Adult family members will always accompany children to meetings with other adults, so teachers, doctors, dentists, coaches. There is no one-on-one time with other adults unless they are a part of the trafficking network. So they will, for example, if they do take a child to the doctor or to a teacher, they will do much more of the talking than usual. Even if the child is old enough to answer questions for themselves, often the parent or the trafficker will be the one answering the questions. They will make excuses for behaviors or medical issues with children. And, I saw this a lot when I was growing up, where I actually was able to get a hold of some 30-year-old medical records, even older than that, where I was having a string of urinary tract infections, and my mother took me into the doctor and told the nurse it was because I was wetting the bed at age 7, and the nurse believed her. So would that happen today? It would be much less likely that it would happen today. But I think it's really important we understand that these types of parents in these situations are making a lot of excuses for particular issues that are going on in the family. They won't listen well to other adults with suggestions. As a matter of fact, they will take everything very defensively. It's almost as if when they are told things either that in regard to parenting, in regard to their children, that they immediately become a lawyer and begin defending, almost instantaneous. They jump right on the defensive. I heard a lot of this next statement, therapists are for crazy people. We don't need therapy. There's nothing wrong with us. That was very common in my family to hear those statements made. And it's really interesting that I grew up and decided to go get my MSW, and I think that every family member in my immediate family was extremely bothered by that fact. And if any adults get too close to the children, the family will pull them from the activity. So they'll switch doctors. They'll, make sure that whatever it might be, the children learn not to get very close to others. So what's happening on the inside with the family? The family is trafficking through generations. So when I say that, it isn't just, this relationship of trafficking is not just one family member, like a dad to one child. This is an entire community of family members who are all engaged in this process, either in the trafficking or in the enabling of the trafficking, or in the sexual abuse, which then preps the child or teaches the child or brainwashes the child. So uncles, aunts, cousins, grandparents, they're all a part of the problem. The brainwashing is strategic and calculated. What I mean by that is it's not happening by accident, okay? It's very cult-like in nature, and it's very calculated in that there's a thought process behind it. It may be happening on an unconscious basis, but it is very calculated, and more than likely, the parents that are doing it to the children, they learned it from their parents when they were children. And the family environment works on a barter system. So you do for me, and I will do for you. You screw up, you pay. Sex is traded for things, money, toys, and the punishment for bad behavior or bad grades or talking too much is always the same. So why is nobody talking about family-controlled trafficking? Well, make no mistake, this is a cult. And in cults, the brainwashing runs very, very deep. So leaving a family like this requires a person to question their entire understanding of how the world works. So that is a tremendously difficult thing to do. When somebody comes forward, like when I am working with people who are leaving their families behind, there is a tremendous amount of pain, emotional pain, in many cases physical pain because of the mind-body connection, which is almost, it's inextricable in nature. So these people are suffering. This is, as I said earlier, a very difficult decision that they are making. So they're really making a decision that's probably the most painful thing they're going to do in their lives, and it requires just so much deep effort and going through a lot of pain and grief because many of us, I have found, are still waiting for our parents to do the right thing. We're still waiting for our traffickers to apologize, to make the right decision, to love us the way we were meant to be loved. And so the idea of walking away from it, of giving up on that ever happening, it requires a lot of grief and loss. So the last part here is that families make it clear that children will be cut off financially if they speak up or leave. Often in these kind of families, they will continue to use financial control well into adulthood for these children. So it's really difficult for children who maybe are struggling financially, maybe they're still pretty new to the workforce, or because of their trauma, they're having trouble holding a job because they have these physical traumatic responses to earlier situations, or their mental health is they're struggling from some kind of mental health diagnosis. All of these can make it very difficult for a child who doesn't have a lot of financial income to break away from these families. So why is nobody talking about it again? Let's talk about some of the beliefs that are associated with the brainwashing. The first one is the biggest one that we see. Pretty much everybody I've ever talked to who's come out of this environment has had it. You are a worthless human being. You deserve to be abused, and it is your fault, okay? Excuse me. Now, I am not referring to people believing this necessarily on a kind of an external cognitive level, like a conscious level. Many of the people that I work with know full well their adult cognitive conscious self knows this isn't true. The problem is that it has been ingrained in the inner child, in those inner parts of them that are still holding these beliefs. And it is very difficult to get to the bottom of where these beliefs are coming from and how they're impacting our lives. But it makes it very difficult to stand up for ourselves when we believe we're worthless, when we believe we deserved it, when we believed it was our fault. How can we then turn around and say, oh, well, but it's okay, I can leave this family because I'm better than that, I deserve better than that. It's a very difficult thing to turn that corner on. Another belief, you cannot survive on your own. You are tied to the family forever. Without the family, you will die. I work with many survivors who say to me, I don't even feel like an adult. I feel like when I'm in a community of other adults, I don't feel like I even belong there. I'm not one of them, and it's because we're often told that these that we will never be able to survive on our own, and we're told that because as a control mechanism, of course, but then it sticks with us, and it can be with us forever. And so I see this, and I'm constantly addressing this with other survivors. The next one is also huge. You are powerless to make change in your life. So you are a victim. I find that it is very difficult for people who come from these environments to say, okay, I have enough power over my life to make changes. And even when we're able to say that at a macro level, it can be very difficult then to say it in a micro level. So, for example, something is going wrong during the day. So what ends up happening is we go, I'm powerless to change that. Even on a micro level, I'm powerless to change this one little thing. I'm powerless to make my life better, even in the little things on a daily basis. So how in the world can I walk away and talk about my experiences with my family if I feel this powerless just to get myself through the day without being victimized by my own circumstances? So then the next one is, if you step out against the family, retaliation will be fierce. This is such an important point. So many of these people have been threatened with their life. They've been threatened with their siblings' lives. They've been threatened. With severe pain. I know that when I first began talking about this particular aspect of my life, when I first started blogging, I was so paranoid that I thought that my trafficker was going to be at my front door at any moment. I was scared to death. And that wasn't because I was making it up. It was because I had been threatened. I had experienced severe death threats, and I was absolutely convinced that they were coming for me. And a lot of that also has to do, there's a significant power differential between a parent and a child. Obviously, I think all of us on that call understand that point. But when we grow up, we don't always, or we don't recognize the fact that power differential has actually gone away. It's taken me a long time to realize that once very powerful, scary, older than me, bigger than me guy is now in his 60s with a heart condition and, weighs just a little bit more than me probably. It's just, we still carry that significant power differential that we experienced as a child with us, even though now there really isn't one. If anything, I've become the more powerful one because I have gained my voice back. And, he wakes up every morning wondering if he's going to be arrested that day, right? So I know in my cognitive mind this power differential has shifted, but it doesn't necessarily mean that inner child part of me has fully bought into that idea. So the next one, nobody on the outside can be trusted. This is something that, Pimps use this as well. This is not specific to a family environment here, but we're told when we're growing up from a very young age that police officers, teachers, social workers, all of the people that our family understands could help us, our family makes sure that we think can't be trusted. So it's brainwashing, and it works because it keeps us from opening up to those people. So next I want to talk a little bit about, what can we do? How can we help? And the most critical thing that we can do to help is to be aware. It really requires us to be aware in a very different way than how we may have been aware in the past. We have to begin to break through the stereotypes in our mind. So that's why the first slide that I presented you with here today was about the stereotypes, because we have to start looking at trafficking differently. Just because a buddy, quote unquote, is a bona fide family member, it doesn't mean they are safe. And for those of you who have worked in trafficking before, you may have heard the term buddy associated with trafficking, and it's when somebody may go into a medical facility with a buddy, and that buddy is actually either a trafficker or they're a bottom, or there's somebody who's associated with the trafficker. And often it's taught that if that buddy is a family member, it's probably okay. And so I'm kind of throwing out this idea that that's not necessarily the case. The next point, anti-trafficking work cannot be done in a silo. So there's, trafficking has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. In some cases, funding has even been kind of diverted to the trafficking aspect of violence from other areas like domestic violence, like sexual assault or sexual abuse. And so there are organizations that are popping up that are specifically focused on trafficking. And when I worked in social services, I can tell you that I was told by people in that organization that trafficking was not their issue, that they were there, they were focused on abuse, they were focused on families, and trafficking wasn't a part of their problem. And, I obviously did some education in those moments, but I think we have to understand that if social services and domestic violence organizations are not front and center in the fight against family-controlled trafficking, then we are not identifying all of the victims of trafficking. We will not. It's impossible, because it is those organizations, social services and domestic violence organizations, who are most likely to see family-controlled trafficking. And while, I commend the work being done by anti-trafficking organizations and by the police, I'm very happy with all that they have accomplished. I think it's really, really important that we understand there is an aspect of trafficking that is being largely overlooked, or it's being found in a very different way, and in a way we're a bit lucky that it is being found. So, one of the things that matters to me a tremendous amount is the term trauma-informed. I know you guys have heard this term millions of times, and people have come up with definitions to the term trauma-informed. There's probably hundreds of definitions out there, but in reality, people may know the term, people may claim the term, but the real question is, do people really understand what it means? There is an amazing TED Talk by a woman by the name of Sandy Scalaney. She's with the Ignition Fund, and so if you Google Sandy Scalaney, it will absolutely pop up. She has done a TED Talk on a concept called transformational relationships. She is a survivor of the streets. She's not a trafficking survivor, but she is a survivor of the streets. She's been through some extremely difficult circumstances in her own early life, and through that, she has learned a level of compassion that I think everybody can, try to reach in their lives. But she talks about this idea that transformational relationships are what remove vulnerabilities. And transformational relationships, in a nutshell, are relationships that are different from what that person is used to experiencing. So, I will often tell people who are in the medical community or that are in, law enforcement communities, don't replace the pimp. Don't replace the trafficker. Don't become the person who now has control over that individual, because you are not doing them any good at all. What you need to do is become the person who is safe, who is understanding, who is empowering the victim, not judging them, and allowing that person not only to trust you. Now that takes time, of course, but to be able to make mistakes, be able to go away, come back again, and know that you're still there. So this idea of endurance is an extremely important aspect of this work as well. So we have to look at trauma-informed in a new light, in a new way, and not just the definition on a piece of paper, but what does it really mean to be trauma-informed? And the idea of the transformational relationship is a great way to look at it. So I thought I'd explain a little bit about how I help survivors in the work that I do. I currently run a business that's called Beating Trauma, in case you haven't seen the constant logos at the bottom of the page here. But what I do with that is I provide guidance to survivors. And that guidance is based on my own personal experiences of my own journey through recovery. And I love working with survivors in tandem with therapists who are already working with them. I feel like we often can have this really powerful dynamic between the three of us where we can just get very deep. And I just wanted to cover some of the things that I work with survivors on, or if they don't work with me, that I recommend that they do. The first one is building awareness. When we have grown up in families like these, where there is sexual abuse and sex trafficking, and it is generational in nature, we are carrying a tremendous amount of unconscious baggage. And unfortunately, it is running our lives. So it is very, very important that we look at awareness and how can we begin to uncover what is really manifesting our lives, because we can say all day consciously that, well, I mean, I know it's not my fault, or I know I didn't cause it to happen, and I know I'm worth something. Cognitively, we may say that, but how do we know whether or not all of those aspects of self, because when there's trauma, when there's complex trauma, many aspects of self have separated. We have dissociated a good portion of who we were as a child. And that part of us, that separated part of us, that unconscious part of us, is still holding all of those beliefs that were, that she was brainwashed with when she was growing up. So it's about, how do we get to that? How do we reach the unconscious? And that can really only happen through awareness. So I really encourage all of the survivors in my community to meditate, to build awareness, to start breaking down the cognitive defenses that we have put in place so that we can access what is underneath them. So the next point here is inner family systems. So what do I mean when I say that? I kind of explained a little bit above here about this idea of the inner child, or in many cases we have other parts. So if we've been through trauma and we've separated and dissociated, we have the inner child. We may have an inner teenager. We may have an inner 20-something. We may have many inner children. But the idea is to get an understanding of what is happening in the unconscious. What belief systems are these parts of us carrying, and how can we start to integrate all of that? Because dissociation will bring about this kind of separation. So the next thing we have to do when we have these belief systems is we have to rewire the brain. And I'm sure all of you are somewhat aware of the tremendous amount of brain research that's been done when it comes to trauma. But one aspect of that research talks about the way we think becomes kind of ingrained. It's almost like we are wearing a path through our brain over and over again, and it gets deeper and deeper, and it becomes less and less likely that we can think in any other way. And so what I work with survivors on is how we can start to essentially change our minds. So we have to begin looking at these belief systems that are deeply ingrained, deeply wired, and start to provide evidence to the contrary. I like to say that our inner parts aren't stupid. When they come up with these beliefs, it's because of a lot of evidence. There is a tremendous amount of evidence that proves those beliefs to be accurate. So we have to go in and say, but I want to provide you in a loving and caring way with evidence to the contrary. How can, for example, a huge one for survivors of this type of trauma is trust. not trusting anybody. Okay, everybody's bad. Everybody's going to screw me over. Everybody's going to manipulate me. Okay, so what do we need to do to start providing evidence to the contrary? Typically what we believe is what we see. So if we can become aware of what we believe, we can start to say, what if it wasn't true? What if it worked differently? What if I could find somebody who we could trust? So it is a tremendously complex process, but it is critical to changing our lives and the way we view things. So the next thing that I tell survivors is critical to the process is body work. So when I'm working with survivors, a lot of times I hear from them, they'll say, I'm stuck. I feel stuck. I can't move past this point. And what normally will assist dramatically in getting people unstuck is body work. And when I say body work, I'm talking about anything where we're getting into the muscles and the body and moving the trauma up and out. So it could be yoga, it could be massage, it could be craniosacral work, it could be Reiki, anything where we are saying, okay, body, let's start releasing some of what is being held at this time. And that is a really good way to get unstuck. It is also a really good way to bring up trauma that needs to be processed. So that's important. Another huge part of working with survivors is the concept of community. We have to begin reducing isolation. Isolation is a powerful tactic for any kind of trafficker, whether that's a pimp or a family trafficker. And unfortunately, when we get to adulthood, we continue to isolate. We keep that because it's better than attempting to trust another individual and having our hearts broken once again. So we isolate. And so what I work with survivors on is to establish community, stay out there, and, interact with other survivors. There is so much healing that can happen in community. And then the last one here is taking small steps. So being able to get people to change their behavior even in the very smallest way. Tiny little things. Just, add another 5 minutes here or change the way we respond to this one little trigger that may be driving us crazy. So, hello? Okay, they're muted. So I think it's all of these things. Unfortunately, when it comes to trauma in this type of work, there isn't just one thing that will fix it. It requires a collaboration of a ton of different aspects in order to reach all of the areas that are impacted by a life of complex trauma, especially that has been committed by family members in particular. And then I'm going to pass this back over to Chick.
Yep. All right. So this is Chick Dabby, and I'm going to speak a little bit about help seeking, but I'm actually going to move back to a couple of slides that Elizabeth, you showed. So I just wanted to make the point about, one moment, sorry. Elizabeth, you, I think, made some wonderful and really important points. I just want to draw out a couple of issues that I noted. Firstly, when you were talking about being trauma-informed, at a very basic level, I think trauma-informed is being approaching the survivors we work with by thinking about what is it, what happened to you instead of feeling what's wrong with you. So I think that's really an important piece under trauma-informed that we need to address. And I think you also alluded to complex trauma. So related to our understanding of trauma is understanding that there are many types of trauma: historical trauma, complex trauma, the sort of daily microaggressions that accumulate, and where there may not be a single big event, but there are a series of daily things that then erode our sense of self, and all these add up. And I think in this slide, where the critical point, I really liked the way you addressed transformational relationships. What I want to emphasize there is the issue of removing vulnerabilities, because traffickers know how to prey on vulnerability. They are actually very skilled at identifying vulnerabilities, creating vulnerability where some may not exist, and then exploiting it. And I think throughout your presentation, when you were talking about enablers and traffickers, you really managed to draw out and draw our attention to the issue of vulnerabilities and how they're established and built into this kind of inner family system as well. On the next slide, I want to just draw a couple of points that you made about, I actually wanted to ask you a question there when you talk about how I help survivors in my work. And earlier on, Elizabeth, you mentioned that you were waiting, and you've heard other survivors waiting for some sign of apology, contrition, acknowledgement, accountability by your traffickers and enablers. So could I ask you to say a little bit about that? Is that part of how one might understand ways to help survivors with that piece of it? And does it mean taking action against traffickers, participating in the prosecution? If you could just say a little more, that would be really helpful.
Yes, well, actually, Judith Herman talks a little bit about these concepts of masks that stop us from moving forward in our trauma recovery. They can actually keep us from healing. One of the masks is actually specifically called the compensation mask. She has 3 masks, and one of them is the compensation mask. And the whole point behind the compensation mask is, I'll start my recovery when I am compensated for all that happened to me. And that can come in many ways. That can certainly come as justice, right? Or it can also come in the form of that apology. And what I've found is that survivors can stagnate in their own recovery because they get hung up on that being a requirement for them to heal. And while it is nice to have, I think it's one of the things that I really stress in my work with survivors is, while it is nice to have the justice, it is nice to have the apology, the biggest favor you can do for yourself is to not rely on that external compensation in whatever form it may come in order to do your own healing. You don't need an apology to begin moving forward with your own life in a different way. But it's hard because that inner child part of us is still looking at life in that way of expecting compensation or happiness or future life to come from some external source, as opposed to coming from within ourselves. So it's about shifting out of that mindset. By no means am I saying don't support a compensatory approach. That should certainly be done in parallel, but to start helping the survivor to relieve themselves of the necessity of it in order to heal.
Right, and actually that really connects to some of the thinking about asking or waiting or expecting forgiveness, that if healing is latched onto being on just admissions of accountability and perpetrators asking for forgiveness, it still keeps the control in their hands. So your healing then ends up depending on, is still in some way controlled overtly and covertly, controlled by the abuser. So yeah, that's a very great point. So thank you.
Yeah, and
okay.
I can.
Yeah.
I was just going to say I can talk for hours on forgiveness alone because I in the work that I do, we often refer to it a little bit as the other F word, because there can be so many things tied to the word forgiveness that can get survivors stuck, so to speak, in that they're like, well, until I have to forgive, but I've been told that forgiveness means that I have to somehow allow that abuser back into my life or be nice to them or something else. So I personally usually stay away from the word forgiveness when I'm working with survivors, and we'll use words like letting go, moving on, any term that makes it more of an inner process, even though many definitions of forgiveness say that it is an inner process. It can be a very loaded word. It gets a lot of meanings associated with it that really aren't right for the word. But I mean, I'll tell survivors, you don't have to give forgiveness. You can heal without making a cognitive decision to forgive. In my life, forgiveness has come organically as I have healed. It was never a decision I made. It's just happened as a part of my own letting go of my own pain. And that is really what forgiveness is.
Yes, thank you. So I want to just very quickly cover some areas of help seeking, which we have focused on at the Asian Pacific Institute, because what we've seen over the years is that many of us have negative experiences of help seeking, and so do many of the individuals and survivors that we work with. So just a brief sort of point I want to make here, and Elizabeth, the dynamics that you described really are iterated in this. So when we have exposure to multiple forms of abusers and different abuses by a range of abusers, which in the trafficking instances, of course, the traffickers, the enablers, the buyers, siblings, other family members who are engaged in the structure, it shrinks the pool of potential helpers, and it actually increases danger because somebody might mistakenly trust the wrong person, or somebody in the family might pretend or act as if they're, can be trusted and confided in, and that can actually then increase the danger and the harm. The other aspect of help-seeking behavior, the factor that influences help-seeking, are the context of societal oppressions. And I think, Elizabeth, you really pointed out sort of familial oppressions and ways that, normalcy is created, etc. So when you have these familial oppressions, oppressive structures, it diminishes access, it increases barriers to services, and it increases the abuser's impunity. So many times, abusers will say, see, nobody believed you, or see, other people thought you were crazy, or other people thought you were making this up, or somehow it's your fault. So that, again, then affects how people receive and seek help. Many times there are very negative actions and attitudes of helpers, and that colors our ability to trust other people and to trust our own judgment. Elizabeth, you really pointed out how enablers work to erode trust and in very deliberate ways. So these kinds of negative actions of helpers then later on when survivors come to seek help, they're their attempts are already influenced by these past negative experiences. And of course, victim blaming is something we all are deeply, completely and frequently confronted with when we're talking to survivors, or even in our own lives, of course, as survivors and advocates. And the notion of you deserve to be abused. These, especially with children, children's credibility gets attacked, and women's credibility also gets attacked when they claim to be victimized. So the purpose of making these points, next slide, is to show that by the time survivors come to us and we are working with them, they have negative and positive histories of help seeking. So not only do they have histories of abuse, but there are histories of negative histories of help seeking. Next slide. So I want to just make actually one point I wanted to draw out where, Elizabeth, you talked about healthcare and, showing up with a buddy, and then how healthcare systems may not recognize people. So I just want to say that, oftentimes what are seen as typical sort of teen issues by a healthcare provider actually could be indicators of being trafficked. So somebody, a teen who isn't getting her periods, and a healthcare worker might dismiss that as, oh, there's one more teen who can't be bothered with her periods and is, taking some steps to delay them or not have them frequently. But actually that could be a trafficked teen where the pimp or the trafficker or the controller is, repeatedly dosing them with Depo-Provera so that they don't get their period. So there are many ways, that many points of contact where people can come in and be trained to identify trafficked individuals. Elizabeth, do you want to take on the questions that are showing up about reporting and identifying to CPS?
Yes, we did have one question about should it be reported, and if it turns out not to be trafficking, because there could be retaliation. And I think it's really important that if there is even a suspicion of trafficking, that it be reported, and keeping in mind that when you're reporting to CPS, unless somehow the accused can prove that you are retaliating in some way, then that CPS is required to keep your identity anonymous. So it is a safe process to report to CPS, and I do highly recommend that if you have any suspicions about trafficking within a family, that you report them. And of course, if you're a mandated reporter, depending on what it is that you do, and maybe a requirement in your case to report it. And honestly, even if you report something and it isn't trafficking, but it is abusive, then you're doing the right thing. I mean, no matter what is happening, it needs to be reported. And that kind of comes back to that whole point I was making earlier about not treating trafficking like a silo, because in reality, there could be multiple things going on there.
Okay, we have 5 minutes left. Do you want to address some of the resources that you've listed?
Well, I was scrolling through the questions because I did get a little bit away from actually responding to them because it was of the presentation. But I see one here that says, how do you balance not becoming the pimp with ensuring safety when you have a child who will not identify as a victim and is at risk of running away? And there's been a lot of work done with that. I think this is a tough one because we can't lock people up because they're victims. There's a lot of discussion that's gone on with law enforcement and whatnot about having facilities that are recovery facilities but that are locked I am not a proponent of that sort of thing. I think it really can promote the continued problem with people believing that they're being controlled, they're being victims. It just continues the victimization. I think the important point is to be that transformational relationship for those kids, to tell them that you'll always be there, and to hope that they will begin to identify as that victim. I guarantee you that if you're a trusted adult and you are planting that seed with them that, hey, you're being victimized here, this isn't your fault, that will sink in. It may not be on the time schedule you want it to be, but it will sink in. I know that kids in these situations are looking for an adult who understands. And while they may not know if they can trust you, it may take them a while to realize they can. It's better than locking them up. I see another question here. How would you recommend working with adults who may be enablers? That is a tough one. Working with adults, if they are enablers, they more than likely have experienced the abuse themselves. And many enablers they don't want to lose their children, but they also aren't sure how to take responsibility for what is happening. They're scared. They're petrified. They're being abused themselves more than likely, and they themselves don't know how to get out of this mindset. I work with parents a lot who know they're not going to abuse, but are still struggling with all of these nasty belief systems that they attained when they were growing up. And it really is that kind of those belief systems that come from being a constant victim over a long period of time that will impact the enabler's belief that they can do anything about what is happening to them and their children. But they have to. I am not above pulling children from an enabler who is not fixing the problem. Once they are an adult, they do have a responsibility to protect their children. And if they are not, then they may suffer those consequences. That being said, they need assistance. They need help. They need therapeutic resources. They need to start recovering from their own trauma.
Okay. This is Chick. So that's a good point about just going to resources.
Yes, these are some excellent resources you can check out. They're very focused on trauma. If you don't look at anything else, I highly recommend the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, especially if you're working with adults who have been through this type of trauma. It can be really helpful to help people understand how their experiences in their childhood are now impacting their current life, especially related to their own physical health. We see a ton of just, really unusual physical manifestations of trauma that can come in some of the most unique ways. So I recommend checking out some of these resources when you get an opportunity and learn a little bit more about how complex trauma impacts everyone.
Okay, and on that note, this is Chick Dabby. Just want to thank everybody. I want to point out that the Institute is also a resource. We provide training, technical assistance. We can be available for any kind of information you want, and setting up special responses to training and technical assistance needs. I think it's been really an honor, Elizabeth, to learn from you, and we all as a field and as advocates have to really thank and recognize the expertise of survivors because they are the ones who teach us how to provide the trauma-informed, survivor-centered services that we all aim to do. So thank you, Elizabeth, very, very much, and thanks everybody for being on the webinar.